All right, what's up, everybody? It's time to get into those domestic financial practices where tragedy and hope. I'm on page 54 still. All right, let's get into it. In each country, the supply of money. Whoops. All right. In each country, the supply of money took the form of an inverted pyramid or cone balanced on its point. In the point was the supply of gold and its equivalent certificates. On the intermediate level was a much larger supply of notes, and at the top, with an open and expandable upper surface, was an even greater supply of deposits. Each level used the levels below it as reserves, and since these lower levels had smaller quantities of money, they were sounder. They have that in quotes. A holder of claims on the middle or upper level could increase his confidence in his claim on wealth by reducing them to a lower level. Although, of course, if everyone or any considerable number of persons tried to do this at the same time, the volume of reserves would be totally inadequate. Notes were issued by banks of emission with an E or banks of issue, and were secured by reserves of gold or certificates held in their own coffers or in some central reserve. The fraction of such a note issue held in reserve depended upon custom, banking regulations, including the terms of the bank's charter. Sorry about that. Okay. So the fraction of such a note issue held in reserve depended upon the custom banking regulations, including the terms of the bank's charter or statute laws. There were formerly many banks of issue, but this function is now generally restricted to few or even to a single central bank in each country. Such banks, even central banks, were private institutions owned by shareholders who profited by their operations. In the 1914 to 1939 period, in the United States, Federal Reserve notes were covered by gold certificates to 40% of their value, but this was reduced to 25% in 1945. The Bank of England, by an act of 1928, had its notes uncovered up to £250 million and covered by gold for 100% value over that amount. The Bank of France in the same year set its note cover at 35%. These provisions could always be set aside or changed in an emergency such as war. Deposits on the upper level of the pyramid were called by this name, with typical banker's ambiguity and in spite of the fact that they consisted of two utterly different kinds of relationships. Lodge deposits, which were real claims left by a depositor in a bank on which the depositor might receive interest, since such deposits were debts owed by the bank to the depositor. And two, created deposits, which were claims created by the bank out of nothing as loans from the bank to depositors, quote unquote, who had to pay interest on them since these represented debt from them to the bank. In both cases, of course, checks could be drawn against such deposits to make payments to third parties, which is why both were called by the same name. Both form part of the money supply. Lodge deposits as form of savings are deflationary, while created deposits, being an addition to the money supply, are inflationary. The volume of the latter depends on a number of factors, of which the chief are the rate of interest, so the interest rate that the Fed sets, and the demand for such credit, so basically how badly people need extra money to pay for things that they need. These two play a very significant role in determining the volume of money in the community, since a large portion of that volume in an advanced economic community is made up of checks drawn against deposits. Notice how, our government even talks like this, like it's all business. Like even our political system has, checks and balances, right? Just like your checkbook has checks and balances, right? The volume of deposits banks can create, like the amount of notes they can issue, depends upon the volume of reserves available to pay whatever fraction of checks are cashed rather than deposited. These matters may be regulated by laws, by bankers' rules, or simply by local customs. In the United States, deposits were traditionally limited to 10 times reserves of notes and gold. So that means that for every dollar that you put into the bank can now lend out $9 based on the fact that your $1 is in the bank. In Britain, it was usually nearer to 20 times such reserves. Wow. In all countries, the demand for and volume of such credit was larger in time of the boom and less in time of the depression. To this, a considerable extent explains the inflationary aspect of a depression, the combination helping to form the so-called business cycle. So that's basically like the boom-bust cycle. In the course of the 19th century, with the full establishment of the gold standard and of the modern banking system, there grew up around the fluctuating inverted pyramid of the money supply a plethora of financial establishments which came to assume the configurations of a solar system, that is, of a central bank surrounded by satellite financial institutions. In most countries, the central bank was surrounded closely by the almost invisible private investment banking firms. These, like the planet Mercury, could hardly be seen in the dazzle emitted by the central bank, which they, in fact, often dominated. Yet a close observer could hardly fail to notice the close private association between these private international bankers and the central bank itself. In France, for example, in 1936, when the Bank of France was reformed, its board of regents, directors, was still dominated by the names of the families who had originally set it up in 1800. See, so this is how, these plans get passed down, because most people, they can't understand how a plan could have started in, say, the 1800s and still be affecting them today with people that are not even in the same family. It's all about the system being set up. And then if you don't fit into the system that they already set up to do this, then you won't be in these positions. Okay. To these had been added a few more recent names, such as Rothschild, added in 1819. In some cases, the name might not be readily recognized because it was that of a son-in-law rather than a son. Otherwise, in 1914, the names frequently those of Protestant of Swiss origin who arrived in the 18th century, or of Jews of German origin who arrived in the 19th century, had been much the same for more than a century. Okay. So they're basically, explaining how, these people keep moving up into these organizations, and they're different people, but they're basically following the same, plan. In England, a somewhat similar situation existed, so that even in the middle of the 20th century, the members of the court of the Bank of England were chiefly associates of the various old merchant banking firms, such as Baring Brothers, Morgan Greenfeld, Lazard Brothers, and others. In a secondary position outside the central core are the commercial banks, called in England the joint stock banks, and on the continent frequently known as deposit banks. These include such famous names as Midland Bank, Lloyds Bank, Barclays Bank, Bank in England, the National City Bank in the United States, the Crédit Lyonnais in France, and the Darmstadter in Germany. Outside this secondary ring is a third, more peripheral assemblage of institutions that have little financial power, but do have a very significant function of mobilizing funds from the public. This includes a wide variety of savings banks, insurance firms, and trust companies. Naturally, these arrangements vary greatly from place to place, especially as the division of banking functions and powers are not the same in all countries. In France and England, the private bankers exercised their powers through the central bank and had much more influence on the government and on foreign policy and much less influence on industry, because in these two countries, unlike Germany, Italy, the United States, or Russia, private savings were sufficient to allow much of industry to finance itself without recourse either to bankers or government. In the United States, much industry was financed by investment bankers directly, and the power of these both on industry and on government was very great, while the central bank, the New York Federal Reserve, was established in late 1913. You guys, you catching this? That's the same year where they introduced the income tax for the first time in secret, in a secret vote at night on Christmas night. Well, like, they had the lowest amount of senators or whatever possible in there to get the vote passed. Okay. The New York Federal Reserve Bank was established late 1913 and became powerful much later, after financial capitalism was passing from the scene. In Germany, industry was financed and controlled by the discount banks, while the central bank was of little power or significance before 1914. In Russia, the role of the government was dominant in much of economic life, while in Italy, the situation was backwards and complicated. We have said that 2 of the 5 factors which determine the value of money, and thus the price level of goods, are the supply and the demand for money. The supply of money in a single country was subject to no centralized, responsible control in most countries over recent centuries. Instead, there were a variety of controls, of which some could be influenced by bankers, some could be influenced by government, and some could hardly be influenced by either. Thus, the various parts of the pyramid of money were but loosely related to each other. Moreover, much of this looseness arose from the fact that the controls were compulsive and in a deflationary direction, and were only permissive in an inflationary direction. Okay. Moreover, much of this looseness arose from the fact that the controls were compulsive in a deflationary direction and were only permissive in an inflationary direction. So I guess when it was deflating, then they were able to get more control. But then when inflation was happening, then they would lose control. This last point can be seen in the fact that the supply of gold could be decreased but hardly increased. If an ounce of gold was added to the point of the pyramid in a system where law and custom allowed 10% reserves on each level, it could permit an increase of deposits equivalent to $2,067 on the uppermost level. If such an ounce of gold were withdrawn from a fully expanded pyramid of money, this would compel a reduction of deposits by at least this amount, probably by a refusal to renew loans. So basically, if they add more gold to the system, that's going to cause inflation of the actual value of gold. And since the price of goods and the demand for money is balancing on the price of gold, that would upset the balance basically by causing gold to inflate. Okay. Throughout the modern history of the gold standard has been deflation. Throughout modern history, the influence of the gold standard has been deflationary because the natural output of gold each year, except in extraordinary times, has not kept pace with the increase in output of goods. Only new supplies of gold or the suspension of the gold standard in wartime or the development of new kinds of money like notes and checks, which economize the use of gold, have saved our civilization from steady price deflation over the last couple of centuries. As it was, we had two long periods of such deflation from 1818 to 1850 and from 1872 to about 1897. The three surrounding periods of inflation, 1790 to 1817, 1815 to 1872, and 1897 to 1921, were caused by 1. The wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon, when most countries were not on gold. 2. The new gold strikes of California and Alaska in 1849 to 1850, followed by a series of wars which included the Crimean War of 1854 to 1856, the Austrian-French War of 1859, the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, the Austro-Persian and Franco-Prussian Wars of 1866 and 1870, and even the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, and 3. The Klondike and Transvaal gold strikes of the late 1890s, supplemented by the new cyanide method of refining gold about 1897, and the series of wars from the Spanish-American War of 1898 to 1899, the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, to the most uninterrupted series of wars in the decade 1911 to 1921. In each case, the three great periods of war ended with an extreme deflationary crisis, 1819 to 1873 and 1921, as the influential money power persuaded governments to reestablish a deflationary monetary unit with a high gold content. The obsession of the money power with deflation was partly a result of their concerns with money rather than with goods, but also founded on other factors, one of which was paradoxical. The paradox arose from the fact that the basic economic conditions of the 19th century were deflationary, with the money system based on gold and industrial systems pouring out increasing supply of goods. So it's like we're going into like the commercialized like capitalism where it's no longer, just like merchants creating goods based on the demand of people. Like, say, you make plowshares, and so you make a certain amount of plowshares per year because there's a certain amount of farmers. And now we're kind of moving into this mass production, mass capitalism thing where they have to keep selling stuff in order to keep the money supply liquid and keep deflation going down, because basically when the money stops deflating, they lose power. But in spite of falling prices, with its increasing value of money, the interest rate tended to fall rather than rise. This occurred because the relative limiting of the supply of money in business was not reflected in the world of finance, where excess profits of finance made excess funds available for lending. Moreover, the old traditions of merchant banking continued to prevail in financial capitalism even to its end in 1931. It continued to emphasize bonds rather than equity securities stocks, to favor government issues rather than private offerings, and took to foreign rather than to domestic investment. Until 1825, government bonds made up almost the whole of securities on the London Stock Exchange in 1843. Such bonds, usually foreign, were 80% of the securities registered, and in 1875, they were still 68%. The funds available for such loans were so great that there were, in the 19th century, sometimes riots by subscribers seeking opportunities to buy security flotations and offerings from many remote places, and obscure activities commanded a ready sale. The excess of savings led to a fall in the price necessary to hire money, so that the interest rate on British government bonds fell from 4.24% in 1820 to 3.11% in 1850 and to 2.6% in 1900. This tended to drive savings into foreign fields where, on the whole, they continued to seek government issues and fixed interest securities. All this served to strengthen the merchant bankers' obsession both with government influence and with deflation, which would increase the value of money and interest rates. Another paradox of banking practice arose from the fact that the bankers who loved deflation often acted in an inflationary fashion from their eagerness to lend money at interest. Since they make money out of loans, out of nothing, they are eager to increase the amount of bank credit on loan. Well, yeah, I would be too if I could just loan out money for paper. But this is inflationary. The conflict between the deflationary ideas and inflationary practices of bankers had profound repercussions on business. The bankers made loans to businesses so that the volume of money increased faster than the increase of goods. The result was inflation. When this became clearly noticeable, the bankers would flee to notes or specie by curating credit and raising discount rates. This was beneficial to bankers in the short run, since it allowed them to foreclose on collateral held for loans. 2008 crisis. But it could be disastrous to them in the long run by forcing the value of the collateral below the amount of the loan it secured. But such bankers, deflation was destructive to business and industry in the short run as well as the long run. Let me see how many more pages are left in this section. All right, we're on page 59 right now. The resulting fluctuation in the supply of money, chiefly deposits, was a prominent aspect of the business cycle. The quantity of money could be changed by changing reserve requirements or discounts, interest rates. Oh, discount is an interest rate, okay. In the United States, for example, the upper limit has been set on deposits by requiring Federal Reserve member banks to keep a certain percentage of their deposits as reserves with the local Federal Reserve Bank. The percentage, usually 7 to 26%, varies with the locality and the decision of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Central banks can usually vary the amount of money in circulation by open market operations or by influencing the discount rates of lesser banks. In open market operations, a central bank buys or sells government bonds in the open market. If it buys, it releases money into the economic system. If it sells, it reduces the amount of money in the community. The change is greater than the price paid for the securities. For example, if the Federal Reserve buys government securities in the open market, it pays for these by check, which soon is deposited in a bank. It thus increases this bank's reserves with the Federal Reserve Bank. Since banks are permitted to issue loans for several times the value of their reserves with the Federal Reserve Bank, such a transaction permits them to issue loans for much larger sum. Central banks can also change the quantity of money by influencing the credit policies of other banks. This can be done by various methods, such as changing the rediscount rate or changing reserve requirements. By changing the rediscount rate, we mean the interest rate which the central banks charge lesser banks for loans backed by commercial paper or other security which these lesser banks have taken in return for loans. By raising the rediscount rate, the interest rate, the central bank forces the lesser bank to raise its discount rate in order to operate at a profit. So then the next bank has to raise their rate. Such a raise in interest rates tend to reduce the demand for credit and thus the amount of deposits money. So basically when they raise the interest rate, since it costs more, because basically the interest is basically how much you have to pay on top of the loan. So, the primary is the actual loan amount. Like say you borrow $1,000, that's the primary. And then if the interest is, 10%, then, that other $10 that you have to pay back is the interest. So that's basically what you're paying for money. So if they lower the interest rate to say 5%, and now you can get $100 and you only have to pay $5 back, you're going to be more likely to borrow that money than say if they've raised the interest rate to 20%, and now in order to borrow that $100, you're going to have to pay the bank back $120. You're going to be less likely to want to borrow the $100. Lowering the rediscount rate permits an opposite result. Changing the reserve requirements as a method by which central banks can influence the credit policies of other banks is possible only in those places, like the United States, where there is a statutory limit on reserves. Increasing reserve requirements curtails the ability of lesser banks to grant credit, while decreasing it expands that ability. It is to be noted that the control of the central bank over the credit policies of local banks are permissive in one direction and compulsive in another. They can compel these local banks to curtail credit and can only permit them to increase credit. This means they have control powers against inflation and not deflation, a reflection of the old banking idea that inflation was bad and deflation was good. The powers of government over the quantity of money are various kinds and include A. Controls over central bank, B. Controls over public taxation, and C. Control over public spending. The control of governments over central banks varies greatly from one country to another, but on a whole has been increasing since most central banks have been technically private institutions. This control is frequently based on custom rather than law. In any case, the control over the supply of money which governments have through central banks is exercised by the regular banking procedures we have discussed. The powers of the government over the quantity of money in the community exercised through taxation and public spending are largely independent of banking control. Taxation tends to reduce the amount of money in a community and is usually a deflationary force. Government spending tends to increase the amount of money in a community and is usually an inflationary force. The total effects of a government's policy will depend on which item is greater. An unbalanced budget will be inflationary. A budget with a surplus will be deflationary. So you can see what's happening here. A government can also change the amount of money in a community by other more drastic methods. By changing the gold content of the monetary unit, they can change the amount of money in the community by a much greater amount. If, for example, the gold content of the dollar is cut in half, the amount of gold certificates will be able to be doubled, and the amount of notes and deposits reared on this basis will be increased manyfold, depending on the customs of the community in respect to reserve requirements. Moreover, if a government goes off the gold standard completely, that is, refuses to exchange certificates and notes for specie, the amount of notes and deposits can be increased indefinitely because these are no longer limited by limited amounts of gold reserves. In the various actions which increase or decrease the supply of money, governments, bankers, and industrialists have not always seen eye to eye. On the whole, in the period up to 1931, bankers, especially the money power controlled by international investment bankers, were able to dominate both business and government. They could dominate business, especially in activities and in areas where industry could not finance its own needs for capital, because investment bankers had the ability to supply or refuse to supply such capital. Thus, Rothschild interest came to dominate many of the railroads of Europe, while Morgan dominated at least 2,600 miles of American railroads. Such bankers went further than this. In return for flotation of securities of industries, they took seats on the board of directors of industrial firms, as they had already done on commercial banks, savings banks, insurance firms, finance companies. From these lesser institutions, they funneled capital to enterprises which yielded control away from those who resisted. You see that? So if the people don't want to go along with their system, they're just basically chess playing them to force them out of business. These firms were controlled through interlocking directorships, holding companies and lesser banks. They engineered amalgamations and generally reduced competition until by the early 20th century, many activities were so monopolized that they could raise their non-competitive prices above cost to obtain sufficient profits and to become self-financing, and were thus able to eliminate the control of bankers. But before that stage was reached, a relatively small number of bankers were in positions of immense influence in Europe and American economic life. As early as 1909, Walter Rantow, who was in a position to know, since he had inherited from his father control of German General Electric Company and held scores of directorships himself, who was in a position to know, said, 300 men, all of whom know one another, direct the economic destiny of Europe and choose their successors from among themselves. So here we go. We've got another admission of basically, I wouldn't even say secret society, but I would just say direct collusion against the public by high-level bankers who are claiming that they basically keep it in the family, similar to like a mafia or something like that. Let's just go over that one more time. German General Electric Company owner, basically that had inherited from his father, said, 300 men, all of whom know one another, direct the economic destiny of Europe and choose their successors from among themselves. Okay, I hope you guys are getting that. The power of investment bankers over government rests on a number of factors, of which the most significant perhaps is the need of governments to issue short-term treasury bills as well as long-term government bonds, just as businessmen go to commercial banks for current capital advances to smooth over the discrepancies between their irregular and intermittent outcomes and their periodic and persistent outgoes, such as monthly rents, annual mortgage payments, and weekly wages. So a government has to go to merchant bankers or institutions controlled by them to tide over the shallow places caused by irregular tax receipts. As experts in government bonds, the international bankers not only handled the necessary advances but provided advice to governments and officials on many occasions placed their own members in official posts for varied periods to deal with special problems. This is so widely accepted that even today, that in 1961, a Republican investment banker became Secretary of the Treasury in a Democratic administration in Washington without significant comment from any direction. So you see how they're playing both sides. As long as they're doing what the bank says, they don't care that much if it's a Democrat or a Republican. All right. Naturally, the influence of bankers over governments during the stage of financial capitalism, roughly 1850 to 1931, was not something about which anyone talked freely, but it had been admitted frequently enough by those on the inside, especially in England. In 1852, Gladstone, Chancellor of the Exchequer, declared, "The hinge of the whole situation was this: the government itself was not to be a substantive power in matters of finance, but was also to leave the money power supreme and unquestioned." On September 26, 1921, the Financial Times wrote, "Half a dozen men at the top of the big five banks could upset the whole fabric of government finance by refraining from renewing treasury bills." Right? So they're saying that half a dozen men could basically take down the British government, which was like one of the most powerful governments in human history, right? Just by them not signing a few pieces of paper, basically. In 1924, Sir Drummond Fraser, vice president of the Institute of Bankers, stated, "The governor of the Bank of England must be the autocrat who dictates the terms upon which alone the government can obtain borrowed money." See, like, this is how they're bringing in this Federal Reserve System, you see, where now the banks control the government and not the other way around. Remember how Trump was going to fire the Fed leader, but that never actually happened? In addition to their power over government based on government financing and personal influence, bankers could steer governments in ways they wished them to go by other pressures. Since most government officials felt ignorant of finance, they sought advice from bankers whom they considered to be experts in the field, right? And then the bankers tell them what's going to happen, because the policy, See, this is what people think. Oh, these government officials, they're all genius. No, they're not. They have advisors. They're basically the front man of a group of people that have a specific idea, right? See, since most government officials felt ignorant of finance, meaning they don't understand how this stuff works, right? They don't, like I was saying in that last video, they read, Germs, Guns, and Steel. They read Pursuit of Power. They don't read Tragedy and Hope. They don't read financial stuff. They're more people persons, They have charisma. They know a lot of jokes. They know, crowd psychology, group psychology, how to get people to like you, what's it called? How to win friends and influence people. That's what politicians know. But when it comes to this stuff, they rely on their advisors, their financial advisors. And if their financial advisors are working for the same banks that are trying to control the country and impoverish certain portions of the population, these politicians, government officials, they don't really know. Okay, since most government officials felt ignorant of finance, they sought advice from bankers whom they considered to be experts in the field. The history of the last century shows, as we shall see later, that the advice given to government by bankers, like the advice they gave to industrialists, was consistently good for bankers, but was often disastrous for governments, businessmen, and the people generally. Such advice could be enforced, if necessary, by manipulation of exchanges, gold flows, discount rates, and even levels of business activity. Thus, Morgan dominated Cleveland's second administration by gold withdrawals, and in 1936 to 1938, French foreign exchange manipulators paralyzed the Popular Front governments. As we shall see, the powers of these international bankers reached their peak in the last decade of their supremacy in 1919 to 1931, when Montague, Norman, and J.P. Morgan dominated not only the financial world but international relations and other matters as well. On November 11th, 1927, the Wall Street Journal called Mr. Norman the currency dictator of Europe. This was admitted by Norman himself before the court of the bank on March 21st, 1930, and before the Macmillan Committee of the House of Commons 5 years later. The House of Commons is similar to Congress, and then the House of Lords is similar to the Senate in British politics. On one occasion, just before international financial capitalism ran at full speed on the rocks, which just sank it, Mr. Norman is reported to have said, "I hold the hegemony of the world." At the time, some Englishmen spoke of the second Norman conquest of England, in reference to the fact that Norman's brother was the head of the British Broadcasting Corporation. Wow. So one of them was in charge of the bank, and the other one was in charge of the media. You guys starting to get the picture now? I mean, come on. Oh, there's no conspiracy. It's just happening naturally. It's just happening naturally. It's just a natural occurrence. No one's planning this for hundreds of years. No one was planning to have you screwed over hundreds of years ago. It's just a natural thing. Hey, they just got together and the society, they just need money. So that's how it works. And it just naturally formed that way. It just naturally happened. I mean, come on, man. Nobody planned this. Nobody planned this. Nobody planned this. No, it was just a natural thing. You guys can't say that anymore. You got to stop it. You got to stop it. I mean, I don't see anyone in the chat. No one. Not one person showing me a quote saying that Carol Quigley is not a real person, saying that Bill Clinton is not a real person, saying that any of the facts in this book are not real. I don't see you. Where are you? In the chat. In the chat. Anyone in the chat, tell me that I'm wrong. Come on. Okay. You see what's happening here. They run the bank. They run the media. And everything they do works against you. It might be added that the Governor Norman rarely acted in major world problems without consulting J.P. Morgan's representatives, and as a consequence, he was one of the most widely traveled men of his day. This conflict of interest between bankers and industrialists has resulted in most European cities in the subordination of the former either to the latter or to the government after 1931. So basically, the European countries had their own forms of government, and then they were forced to subordinate to this banking system. This subordination was accomplished by the adoption of unorthodox financial policies, that is, financial policies not in accordance with the short-run interests of bankers. This shift by which bankers were made subordinate reflected a fundamental development in modern economic history, a development which can be described as the growth from financial capitalism to monopoly capitalism. This took place in Germany earlier than any other country and was well underway by 1926. It came in Britain after 1931 and Italy only in 1934. It did not occur in France to a comparable extent at all, and this explains the economic weakness of France in 1938 to 1940 to a considerable degree. All right. That was page 62. The next section will be international financial practices. Can't wait. It's going to be so exciting. Get ready for that. Get your popcorn ready. All right. We're just going to check a few things real quick to verify some of the things that was being said in the book. Now, today I wanted to look at central banks. We did the Boer War thing. In the last, check my last video talking about the Boer Wars. Okay. Oh, let's do a grok. Let's do a grok just to see how that works. Okay. How many countries have a central bank. Okay, so basically almost every sovereign country has its own Federal Reserve, ECB, bank, People's China. Okay. Let's see how many countries don't have a central bank. Monaco, Andorra, Vatican City, and Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Palau. So basically eight countries are the only ones that don't have a central bank. And I mean, are you really counting Vatican City as a country? I mean, the Marshall Islands, I mean, Micronesia, I mean, these are barely, I mean, no disrespect to people that live there, but they're such small, areas of land that they really don't have any political power. Micronesia is like the collection of small islands in like the South Pacific. Vatican City is literally just a small area of like downtown Rome, basically. Monaco, it's also very, tiny. It's like basically like a town in France. It's like a large town or like a large city. It's not even like a real country. Right. And these are the only places that don't have. See, look, these 8 places together have a combined population of 4,600 people, or 4,060 people. No, sorry, 460,000 people, less than the city of Atlanta, right? So why do they don't need to control these places? And see, look, this place uses the Federal Reserve Bank of Austria. This place uses the Federal Bank of Austria. This place uses the dollar, the dollar, the dollar, the European Central Bank, the European Central Bank, and the European Central Bank. So they do have a central bank. They just don't physically have a central bank in their country, right? So we can see that the central bank system does exist. It's real. And we can see from the book that they set it up specifically for the purposes of controlling governments, businesses, and the populations therein of those countries that they have the central banks. So we will check out some more of this stuff later or tomorrow. So until then, have a good day and peace.